Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to the 40th Cruise Justice Show. I think about 8 more shows that'll reach my age. So I think we're doing good here. Um, Today, we have a very special guest. And the reason I say this guest is special is because she's doing the very work that I have a passion, and more. She's working in the law field, she's working in the colleges, and all of this have so many tunnels that go to helping in the death penalty cases, and advocating through the death penalty. But I'm gonna let her tell you about a little bit about that, and for all the ones that's, we're going through this big hardship of COVID, and we bypassing and it's coming back and bypassing, come back. I want to say, stay strong, and those that's incarcerated, stay strong. And Crew Justice is there to try to provide you some entertainment and education at the same time. So my guest today is Miss Sandra Babcock. You know, most people don't understand what's behind the background on a death penalty case. They just think it's a trial. That's what the media covers, the trial, and then it's the person gets sentenced, and that's it. You know, most people don't know the work that people does behind it. So, Ms. Babcock, can you tell the people a little about you and what you do?
Well, sure. First of all, just thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be on your show, Herman, and I really admire the work that you do and the work that Witness to Innocence does. So it's a real pleasure to be on the show with you, and just a shout out to your listeners who are currently incarcerated, and the women and the men out there, and gender nonconforming people. We're in solidarity with you and wishing you well. I am somebody who, when I got out of law school, I went down to Texas to work in an organization that doesn't exist anymore, but that was set up to defend people who were facing execution, people who had already been tried and sentenced to death and were on death row, and in many cases already had execution dates. And these are folks who in many cases had been on death row for decades. And so that was what got me started in this field, and that grew over time. I never really left. I was a public defender for a while in Minnesota. I was in private practice, and I represented Mexico. The government of Mexico had set up a program to defend Mexican nationals facing the death penalty all over the country. And then I started teaching about, in 2006. So it's been a little while now. And now I teach students how to defend people facing the death penalty. We do work with prisoners around the world. We do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. And recently we have started to do a lot of work around women who are facing the death penalty. We're working both with trial teams and defense teams who are representing folks who are already convicted and sentenced to death. And we're working a lot on, to show people how discrimination and bias leads people to it not only affects their lives, that kind of lead them into a path that ends up in their arrest, but also how it affects their capital trials and sentencing proceedings. So that's what I'm working on right now.
You spoke about something that most people don't hear about, and when we talk about the death penalty, most people think about the male version of the death penalty. Very little know about the women that are actually on death row. And it's like I was reading a couple of cases, and it's like Sabrina Butler that we have as a member of Witness Innocence, where she was accused of killing her own child, and experts and everything behind it lied and everything, and she was young, and she wasn't understanding. Uh, Here, I think you're working with a case on from concerning a female now. Am I correct?
That's right. Yeah, I'm working with a number of women who are on death row in Texas and Tennessee and Oklahoma. And the one you're talking about, I think, is Melissa Lucio, who is whose case was just denied by the Supreme Court on Monday. Melissa was convicted of killing her child. But as it turns out, her child had fallen down a flight of stairs that had caused trauma and what has probably caused her death. Melissa, there was, she was a person who had been sexually abused and subjected to pretty terrible trauma, domestic violence throughout her whole life. And she was then brought into a police station after her daughter died. She was interrogated by male police officers who got up in her face, guns in their holsters, and kept badgering her and telling her that she had done it and telling her to confess. And she ultimately, in the middle of the night, about 3 a.m, without having anything to eat, traumatized by her daughter's death, she says, "Well, I guess I did it." And the prosecution used that to argue that she was guilty. And then at trial, a male police officer got up and he said, I knew she was guilty from the minute I saw her because she hung her head down. She was slumped over in her chair. She wouldn't make eye contact. And the defense, they had, to their credit, they had hired an expert, a doctor, who said, what, these are all symptoms of trauma. This is a woman who was traumatized from the time she was a small child. And one of the things that happens when you suffer from trauma, you have PTSD. For some people, you have your reactions are, when you're exposed to trauma and you're exposed to something like an aggressive police interrogation, is to go numb, to withdraw, and to become acquiescent, to want to agree and to submit to authority. And that's what Melissa did. And this expert was ready to testify in her case, and the judge disallowed it and said it wasn't relevant. So she was convicted based on this statement without ever getting a chance to explain to the jury why she said it, even though she wasn't guilty of killing her daughter. And that was the issue in front of the Supreme Court, and they refused to take that case and reverse her conviction.
And that's one of the number one things that is wrong with our justice system: the interrogation process of police officers, when they hold you in that room and they just badger you for hours and hours until they get something that's close to what they want to hear, and they proceed with the case. And the sad part about it, and just like in Melissa's case, first of all, if a woman, I know I lost my child through SID, sudden infant death. And when I found my daughter passed away, I was traumatized. So I can imagine how a woman who's carried a child 9 months would feel about her child, there. And the sad part about it is during the interrogation, she probably didn't really understand what the process of what was going on. She probably didn't even understand her rights to an attorney to be present right there, to be advised of what to do and have counsel there before her. And a lot of officers take advantage of people such as that. And then now she's classified as one of the worst of the worst, because that's what they say the death penalty is for. They say the death penalty is for the worst of the worst. How is she the worst of the worst when the evidence that the state presented was there, but was allowed, but the evidence that she needed there to show that this is improper was denied by a judge. And then here it is, the Supreme Court decides, no, we're not going to hear it. And like they supporting the conduct of these officers with this crazy interrogation. I would like to ask you now, you are a part of Allison Project. Can you explain to people what that project is?
Yes, I can. And thank you for that question. But before I go there, I just want to talk about the police interrogation for another minute. Because I think, people don't realize that innocent people can falsely confess. And it happens all the time. There are so many people who have been wrongly convicted of crimes that they confess to. And police officers, they should receive training. And there's lots of training out there on how to conduct a trauma-informed interrogation. How do you treat somebody who is a victim of trauma in a way that ensures that they're not going to make a false confession, but police officers aren't following those protocols. And so that's what happens to so many people. And it happened in Melissa's case. So the Alice Project is, we started this, and it's named after one of my former clients, Alice Nungu. She was convicted and sentenced to death in Malawi, which is a country in southeastern Africa, for killing her husband. She killed her husband, who was in the middle of abusing her. He was drunk. He came home. He started to beat her. He had been beating her throughout their marriage. He went after her mother, and she picked up an axe and she hit him with the axe, and he died. She went to the police. She brought them back. She showed him his body. She said she did it. She explained why she did it, and they arrested her, charged her with murder, and they sentenced her to death. We eventually got Alice out of prison, but she'd spent 10 years on death row, and she died 2 weeks after her release. So we named this project in honor of Alice. And the reason we started it was because we realized that nobody talks about women on death row. When anybody talks about a woman on death row, the story about her case is really sensationalized. It's like, she's a Black widow. She's a monster. She is an adulteress. Women on death row are judged not just for what they have allegedly done. They're judged for their character, for their deviation from what we expect women to behave like in our society. And we started to look into cases of women around the United States who are sentenced to death. And we found that women, so often prosecutors were bringing in evidence of their, intimate relationships that they had with men, things that they wore, to show that they were, promiscuous, that they had sex, outside of marriage, that they were dressed provocatively. Prosecutors tend to bring up their mothering, the fact that they weren't good mothers. And this is used as aggravating evidence in capital trials to persuade jurors that they should sentence these women to death. And this is so different from what you see in the cases of men, right? So men, imagine, like, there's a case that I'm working on right now where the prosecutor took a woman's pair of underwear that she was wearing at the time of her arrest, and he waves it in front of the jury, and he said, "This is not the kind of underwear that a grieving widow should wear." She was charged with killing her husband because it was a thong. Now, women out there know there are a lot of women who wear thongs, and nobody should be judged. Their guilt should not be judged based on what the kind of underwear they wear. And you can never imagine, like, a prosecutor taking a guy's pair of boxer shorts, or jockeys, and saying, well, this is not the kind of underwear that this guy should be wearing. Like, it would never happen. Prosecutor would never talk about, oh, well, that guy, he wore really tight jeans. Like, it would never happen. They would never talk about a guy, if a guy brings his kids, Christmas gifts every Christmas and, calls them once a week and tells them he loves them. That's going to be mitigating evidence in his case, in his trial. If a woman, abandons her family, but still calls her kids every week and brings them Christmas gifts, no way is that going to be mitigating, because what they're going to say is, where's she been all their life? She abandoned the family. She's the one who's supposed to be there. So they're judged by two different standards. And that's the kind of thing that people really aren't talking about. That's why we started the Alice Project, so that we could start to illuminate this. And you talked about Sabrina, and one of the things that I'm also really interested in and think we need to talk more about is women of color, because women of color are not only facing discrimination based on gender, but they're facing discrimination based on race or their foreign nationality or their gender identity, and we've never really looked at that, because what people say is, we really can't draw any conclusions about women as a category because there are too few of them, so we can't do the research. But we really need to look at their trials, and we need to look at how prosecutors have demonized them and have appealed to these, prejudices that the jurors have based on these, different facets of women's identity.
And that's the sad part about it, because here it is the prosecutors prey on society, what I would call ignorance, because like you say, it wouldn't bring up that a woman wear a thong, and it's a problem. I mean, what is you make them classify as, if a woman wear a thong, she's like a Jezebel from the Bible, or she's a hooker or something like that, when she may just want to feel sexy, and it's crazy that society look at a woman where they have to have perceived this specific line to walk, otherwise she's not a respectful woman of the community. And I think that you're right. We need to educate more people on society about being equal with when it comes down to female. It needs to be equal. Excuse me 1 second. Stop it. It needs to be equal with all, and we're supposed to say we Americans are equal, and we have all these divisions between racism, religions, and now it's to the petty part of male and female, and those that and in prohibiting fair trials. Why are these things brought in? Is to distract you from looking at what is real in the evidence. It makes you overlook the evidence, makes you don't question the evidence, because half of the people in society don't even understand what it means prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They look at these shows and they go to church, or they pick out certain standards. And I'm sure with a female as a defendant, when they go jury trial selection, I am sure they're trying to look for the church going people, and the people that thinks that a woman should be clothed, and but they fail to realize when Eve was first out, Eve didn't have no clothes on. So why are they holding things like this against a woman instead of looking at justice and a bad mom because she moved away? I've worked with people that has addiction, and some of them women done left their kids because they feel like they're doing drugs, and they feel like where they leave them at can give them kids a better life than what they can provide. And to me, you know, to most people that might like, that's a bad mom. But to me, that's actually showing a good mom that's wanting the best for her kids while she's sick. So I don't understand uh, this concept of justice. But Ms. Babcock, you know, you it, I applaud you because going through being attorney, you see a lot of hurtful things that should be done right, and the courts decide that is wrong. What do you have to say uh, about cases like that?
Well, it's, you know, it's really demoralizing because, you know, so a lot of times, you know, that you're right, and you know that um, that there was a massive injustice in a case and can't get the courts to do the right thing. And it leaves you with a sense of futility and grief, you know, especially if you lose the case. And of course, you know, one of my clients earlier this year was executed, and it's just about the worst thing you can experience as a lawyer. You know, but what I always think about is, you know, our clients who are on death row. The thing that is always amazing to me is how often they're the ones cheering me up when they're the ones on death row. Our clients on death row have such courage and such resilience, and they, you know, so many of them are living through hell, and they're, you know, they're continuing to fight, and they're continuing to lead lives that, although they're really difficult, a lot of times they're helping other prisoners, they're helping family members who are on the outside. And that's really inspiring to me. In the case of women, you know, one of the other things I think is really important is so many women, like the vast majority, probably around 90% of women on death row, if not more, have been victims of what we call gender-based violence. So that is either sexual abuse as children, rape as adolescents, children, or as adults, and violence within partnerships, intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And this is such a common experience of women in the criminal legal system. And what we see prosecutors doing all the time is minimizing either accusing women or implying that they're lying about that, or minimizing the consequences of it. So, you know, there's a case that I'm working on now in Texas, a woman named Erica Shepard. And Erica had been in a violent marriage. She fled her abuser. He beat the crap out of her one night. She called the police, she reported him, and they didn't arrest him because he had a friend who was a judge. So they decided not to arrest him. She had to leave town because they didn't arrest her abuser and she had to get away from him. She went to a battered women's shelter, but they ended up evicting her. And 1 month later, she is arrested and charged with capital murder for committing a crime with a guy who had threatened her and coerced her into participating in this crime. She had her baby with her at the time. She's only 19 years old, and they sentenced her to death. And during her trial, the prosecutor, who has a long history of seeking the death penalty against more disproportionately against Black people who kill white people, and Erica's a Black woman. Her victim was a white woman, even though Erica didn't kill her, the co-defendant killed her. And the prosecutor said to the jury, you know, she says she was abused, but does she have any bruises? You know? And of course she didn't have any, I mean, this was like a year after the abuse, right? But she had complained to the police, and the police were the ones that hadn't protected her. So I think what we have to look at here is also the role of the police and the system in failing to protect people when they really need help and could prevent these crimes from happening. Because if people were getting support, if people in poverty were getting the kinds of social support that they needed, so that they had adequate housing, so that they had adequate education, so that they had childcare support, and so they had, somewhere to go if they were being abused. Like so many crimes could be prevented if that were happening, and it's just not happening, and we're not talking about it.
I want to back up for something I read today, and that's back to Melissa case. There's two things that I see in this. One, I want to say, here it is. I was talking about divisions, and we also have division in the court. Here it is, in 2019, her case was actually overturned by the Fifth Circuit because they felt like she didn't have a complete defense, and that was violated in her original trial. Then here it is in 2021, February, they turn around and reverse that they granted. And I really don't understand that, because here it is, the law's supposed to be the law, and the law, those judges go to school for a long time, deal with cases a long time. So if they feel like there's something wrong and they grant relief, why is the other courts coming back reversing that? Especially when you have a situation such as here, where the prosecutor was convicted for bribery and extortion. And, it was suspected he was using Melissa case to be reelected. I mean, this type of things, and is in a death penalty case where the state is actually would take the life. And in the worst state it is, Texas, dealing with the death penalty and possibly killing innocent people. And I mean, why are we so divided by law and have death penalty here in the state? I know I'm just asking your opinion on this. From why is it that we're so divided, especially on something that's deciding a person's life?
It's a great question, and I think that I think one of the things that that a lot of prosecutors do really successfully is they dehumanize the people who are on trial, and they dehumanize the people who are in prison. And they do that not just in death penalty cases, but in pretty much all cases in which they're trying to punish people for crimes that they've committed. And the big struggle here is to convey that people who have committed crimes are still human beings. And I know, Herman, that you're innocent and that you never committed a crime, but and other people in witness to innocent were innocent. But I think the death penalty is wrong, and I know you do too, for everyone. And people who are guilty should not receive a death sentence. It is just a fundamentally inhumane punishment. But I think that a lot of people, it's easier to believe that somebody is just, evil, that they're beyond hope. In a way that is, I think, easier for people. And I think that politicians encourage that kind of thinking, that kind of black and white thinking. It's harder, I think, to grapple with the reality, which is that, all of us are capable of harm. We are all capable of harm given the right circumstances. And, the people who end up on death row generally are folks who have been in harm's way for most of their life. And until we grapple with that fact, and the fact that, nobody is just a perpetrator, everybody is a victim before they become a perpetrator. I don't care who you are. You're a victim of mental illness. You're a victim of abuse, you're a victim of neglect, you're a victim of poverty. And we haven't yet as a society grappled with how, as humans, we are, we are vulnerable, and we are vulnerable to acting out in ways that, are not in anyone's best interest if, our basic needs are not met, and if we are subjected to physical and other forms of violence. So that's a really kind of a deep, sort of rumination on your question, which, I'm sure a lot of people would have different answers to, but to me, it all comes down to that inability that we have as humans, I think, to grapple with the complexity of human beings and our collective responsibility, really, when we think about crime and why people commit crime. And it's because as a society, we are failing to take care of the people who are most vulnerable among us.
It's amazing how people, we have faith in our justice system, and our justice system is so broken, and it revolves around how we was actually raised and how we adapted to society, how we choose to live in society. Because me personally, I do agree with you that, and I try to teach people that before a person committed a crime, believe me, it's something that triggered that. A person is not just going to go and kill and laugh about it and be fun, and unless it's some type of mental illness behind it, or trauma or something like that. Even the word psychopath, if you look at all the serial killers, and how they was raised, and it's something went inside them that that actually triggered them. But I'm getting low on time because it's not that much, but I have to ask this question, if I may get your opinion. For me, I feel like anyone that's supporting the death penalty have mental issues behind them, because I feel like anybody that want to see a person die has mental issues. Now, I do understand that majority of people make the decision to support the death penalty out of anger for a loss of loved one or someone like that, and they don't understand that they're making it and supporting the death penalty out of their feelings, The death penalty is just a way of revenge. And the sad part about it is the legislators, politicians, the people running for office, state attorneys, they throw this around and take advantage of and press this anger, this want for revenge, to get people and family members to push for the death penalty, to say it's for justice, when actually they get no justice behind it. They get no closure behind it. And to actually do that, it is very difficult, because I've seen where people that's been execution, people that's been warden of the prison, people involved with this side of actually setting the execution about, has developed major trauma from being involved in the execution, putting the needles in, walking the person off, they became trauma from that. So we don't have a supporting strong system in the death penalty. So my question to you is, what is the purpose of having a death penalty wouldn't it be more humanized to maybe when, like you say before, when you were talking about aggravating, mitigating circumstance, wouldn't it be before trial to actually see the trauma, the mental placement and things of the person that you're putting on trial, than after waiting until the penalty phase after you done found them guilty to see what the good resolution for the case? Because maybe you, for instance, the case you did for Alice, Alice was defending herself. Alice had been abused, and if somebody keep getting bullied, eventually they gonna strike back. And then when they strike the back, it's gonna be fully out of fear or anger. It's good when they strike back. And just so happened, she struck back with the wrong weapon. And it's like, forget what the victim did to her. Forget what happened to her. It's okay. But you are the worst person because you killed this person that have done this to you. And the state doing the same thing. They're killing the person that killed the victim. So what do you think is the purpose of the death penalty being intact?
I think it has no purpose. And I think that most people who have studied this question, they know that it has no purpose. Its only purpose right now is political. It's to maintain, it's produces and supports the idea that there are certain people who are so dangerous that, there's nothing to be done but to eliminate them from the human race. And that's just a fallacy. It's just not true. There are lots of ways. First of all, a lot of people who commit violent crimes never commit a violent crime again. A lot of violent crimes, as you point out, are situational, or they're product of mental illness or addiction, or other factors. People can be rehabilitated. And in the worst of the worst crimes, you don't have to execute people to keep society safe. And there are a lot of institutions that exist, some of them pretty horrible places, but, in the case that you point out of somebody who is a serial killer, which is a very, very, very tiny number of people on death row. But in those really extreme cases, there would be some, way of keeping society safe by putting a person in an institution, including some of the prisons that exist for that purpose. So the death penalty it's just not necessary anymore. It's a historical anachronism. And we just our politicians just don't have the courage to speak the truth about it. But, it's going to go away. We're going to abolish the death penalty. It's, and we should start right now by reviewing all the cases of people who've been sentenced to death and making some decisions about, do we really want to go through all of this when it's not necessary?
Well, I only supposed to have 30 minutes. I went over, and I can go on and on with you with this, because this is information that people need to know, a side of things that they didn't know. But the last question I have, well, actually two questions. One, if there's anything else you want to say to anyone that's viewing, and the second is, how can people reach out and support you in the work you're doing?
Well, I think we covered a lot of territory, and so I don't think there's too much else I want to say. I do think there's a couple of things that are really important. I think people who are behind bars, they need pen pals. They need people to write to them. They need people to care about them and remember them. And I really respect and admire, like a lot of my clients have pen pals, and those pen pals are a lifeline to them. And I think it's really important, just the humanitarian work that is taking place with organizations that send folks into prisons, that are, doing that kind of supportive work. Our clients really need that. In terms of our work at the Cornell Center and the death penalty worldwide, of course, we always need funding because we just, we don't get any funding from the law school. So everything that we do, we have to really get funding from our donors, and that's what helps us to keep doing the work. We're doing a lot of work in Sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned. We have a death penalty in the United States. There are death penalties in countries around the world, a small number, but they're there, and the conditions are just horrible. The quality of justice they're receiving is even worse in some cases, far worse in some cases than what we see in the United States. And that work takes a lot of resources because those countries are far away. And it takes a lot to get there, but it's really important work. And finally, I think on these cases, if you follow us on our website, we've got a lot of cases that we're putting up and women's cases that we're supporting around the country right now. Petitions that people can sign. This is a movement. So there's so many things that individual listeners can do, including supporting abolition legislation in their home states. But yeah, so those are just some ideas.
Well, you mentioned that you have petitions and things like that. Is it a website that people can go to see these cases or sign the petitions?
Yeah, so for example, if you go to our website, www.deathpenaltyworldwide.org, you'll see on our website, you can go to advocacy and you'll see a number of cases of women there who are on death row. We send out tweets and do social media posts all the time about campaigns and links to petitions. We do blogs. So it's really a combination of ways that we're trying to reach people and educate them about these cases.
Well, again, I thank you for joining us, and I'm sorry it's such time. But I want people to know that we at Witness the Innocent also support the movement over here with Ms. Babcock. In fact, on our website, witnessinnocent.org, you can go to active cases and you can sign petition. Like we have the petition there to sign to help Melissa Lucio. That's how you pronounce it?
That's right.
Melissa Lucio. So you feel free to go on our website, witnessinnocent.org. And you can also contact us, and we can also link you to the website to help at Ms. Cornell, what is called Cornell Clinic?
The Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide.
Okay, so we also can lead you that way. So Witness Innocence isn't just made of exonerees, we're made of information also to assist this, because this is a big fight. And as you see, if you look back on the episode, we've had people with the information, the data, people with litigation, attorneys that's dealing with trial, the penalty phase. There's so many different departments when you're talking about the death penalty, and there's so many things that are going wrong having this death penalty intact. So feel free to join us on Cruel Justice as we go on and on with the guests, and give them some support, give them support, because that's what the key thing is. The education in society, if you look at all the issues that we're talking about, the prosecutor, he come from our society. Why do he think it the way he think? The judges, the potential jurors, all of these people come from our society and how they're raised, where their views at, and things like that. So if you take and share these videos and allow people to see it, and it may not reach everybody, but it may reach that one person that can make a difference in a death penalty case or even in a regular case, but it's important for us as society to join this fight. And if you want to know what you can do to support, come to our website, witnesscenters.org, and you can look up information, look up cases. We have so many death row exoneree stories that to show you that this system is broken. So with that being said, I thank you for joining us for this cruel justice, and I say so long.